as Beth, I think, mentioned, I've been working with Mansions of the Future on a commission for nearly 2 years. And that started as part of a programme called Stories of Rights and Protest. And then kind of more in general was framed around the themes that Mansions was looking at around sort of power and democracy. And a big part of my commission has been working with prisoners at HMP Lincoln. And in particular, I spent a week with a group there in November last year, and together we wrote a script for a sci-fi radio drama, which I then produced and has just been released, previewing on National Prison Radio last month. And then I suppose about that in relation to this, I just want to kind of say that a big part of my practice is kind of learning with other people, and this whole project has been a huge learning experience for me about the criminal justice system, about incarceration. You know, I don't have lived experience of that, so I'm sort of coming to it maybe with knowledge about sort of other institutions and about sort of governance and maybe a kind of a bit of thinking about how we organise society. But I feel like I'm really at the start of a journey and kind of finding out about people's experiences, about how the systems work at the moment, about how they need to change, and then about ideas about abolition and transformative justice. So I feel hugely privileged to welcome Lisa White and John Bowden today, and I'm really excited about our conversation. So thank you very much for joining us, both of you.
Thanks. Maybe Lisa, you want to talk next?
I mean, thank you, for the invite. It's probably the first time I think I've spoken to people in a long time during lockdown. So I'm Lisa White. I'm senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Lincoln. I'm really interested in our use of state power and how the state interacts with the general population, but also how it interacts with corporations. My background is criminology, human rights, PhD, broadly looking at the state's use of torture in Northern Ireland. So really, there's a perception that criminology is about the mind of the serial killer. It's forensic psychology, it's cracker, it's all of those things. When really, for me, criminology is about what gets classed as crime. How do we use this label of crime, and who do we apply it to? And what are the consequences of that application? So today, I really want to be a part of a conversation about those things. What is it that makes us think that prison is a suitable response to harm? And I'm really looking forward to getting into the nuances of that today.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Matt, do you want to just unmute John and we can hear a little bit from John?
Yeah, I was released from prison a few months ago. I spent over 40 years in prison on an indeterminate life sentence. I actually should have been released 20 years ago, but the reasons used for my continued detention was not because I represented the risk to the community, or I was a danger to anyone. I was being held in prison purely because of what was termed my anti-authoritarian behaviour. When I first came into the English prison system in the late 70s, early 80s, it was a truly brutal, horrendous place. Prisoners were being frequently murdered and killed. But it was also a time of great organisation and solidarity amongst long-term prisoners, which I became involved in. And I became very, very politicised in that regard. I would probably be termed by the Americans a state-raised convict because apart from serving a life sentence, I also spent most of my life in institutions from the age of 11, children's homes, reform schools, detention centres and borstalls. I was raised within institutions. And that goes for about 60 to 70% of long-term prisoners in maximum security. They were also state-raised convicts who were fed into the criminal justice system, usually as children. So I became radicalised in prison. I became a prison abolitionist because I could see and I could experience and I could understand that far from prisons existing to protect the public, they existed to exert total and absolute social control over the most marginalised and vulnerable groups, disproportionately black people particularly. Prison is a weapon of social control wielded by the state. It's got absolutely nothing to do with protecting the public. And of course, conspicuously absent from the prison population in terms of its social composition are corrupt bankers, multi-millionaire financiers, wreckers of the environment, and murderous police officers. Most of the prison population is not composed of a hard core of criminals. Those convicted of murder or rape form a tiny, almost insignificant minority of the overall prison population. Most of the prison population is composed of the very poor, the destitute, the mentally ill, drug addicts, and a disproportionate amount of young black men. It's wielded as a weapon of absolute social control, and it's focused on various groups in order to disappear them into the prison system. So, as I say, I was radicalized by my experience of that in prison and attempted to collectivize and empower prisoners, because one of the prime functions of the prison system is to totally disempower the prisoner and strip them of all civil and human rights. And the relationship of prisoners to the state is virtually one or almost one of slaves. We had no rights whatsoever. We could be murdered, brutalized, tortured. And the only way that we could resist was collectively fighting back, thereby shifting the balance of power.
John, thank you so much for sharing all this. I think this is probably a good place that we could start hosting the conversation now. I think first thing I kind of wanted to ask was about your theories of prison abolition, because John, I know that you're very much a staunch abolitionist, and I'd like for you to expand a little bit on that. Maybe Lisa, you can also talk in regards to this, so some of the audience who probably aren't aware can hear about what abolitionism is and what the current structure of prisons, how they currently operate right now, and why there's such opposition towards that.
Who would you talk, me first? If there is a relationship between prison and protecting the public or maintaining law and order, it's an inverse one, okay? Prisons are actually a danger to the public, because what they effectively do is take in or imprison people that are already marginalised and alienated from society. They alienate them further, they disempower them, they brutalise them, and they dehumanise them, and then they cast them back into society. The driving force behind prison expansionism today isn't protection of the public, it's the prison industrial complex, right? Which started in America, because, you know, the modern penitentiary system in America was a continuation of the slave system. That's why you've got a massively disproportionate amount of black people in prison in America. And it's private corporations that are now building and financing prisons. And they're using prisons as sites of cheap, enslaved, coerced labour. That's the reality. Prisons are not there to protect the public. They're there to discipline and punish the rebellious poor, to maintain the social hierarchy in society, and the financial aspect is to savagely exploit prisoners and turn them into slaves.
John, so it is true that the UK has the most privatised prisons in Europe, and I think it was actually you that educated me onto this fact. I wanted to ask about both of your opinions on sort of like the differences between state-run and private prisons, if there are any.
Well, in my experience, there isn't any. They're both there to serve one purpose, and that's to punish and imprison and dehumanise the occupants, whether it's run by a private multinational corporation or whether it's run by the state. State prisons and private prisons are now very much blending. Even in state prisons, most of the workshops are privately owned, okay? So even if you're in a state-run prison, you are coerced to work for a private company for slave labour, slave wages. If you don't, you're placed on a basic regime and punished, coerced labour. So there isn't a fundamental degree of difference between state and private prisons. They both serve the same purpose.
And I think, you know, it's really worth thinking and talking about, well, what is the purpose of prison? because we're led to believe that it's common sense, we're led to believe that it does something about the crime rate, when actually if you look at the research, be it historically or all over the world, there's no correlation between rates of incarceration and rates of recorded crime. And the thing for me is prison fails by its own logic. So we say that we incarcerate as retribution, but this retribution is just, that it's proportionate. Well, actually, we all experience punishment in different ways. And it's really, really hard to measure harm inflicted, both on the victim on the outside and the offenders on the inside. You know, we just can't measure them in social reality that way. You know, and this idea of deterrence, you know, we've got this idea that you deter the offender by inflicting harm on them. You deter the rest of us by the visibility of the infliction of harm on the offender. But actually, that's based on a lot of assumptions. That, again, we can measure non-events, that things that don't happen can be measured in that way. And it also assumes that all crime is a rational choice, that people weigh up the costs and benefits, that they have the freedom to do so from an equality point of view. So this idea of deterrence just doesn't stack up. And then we might talk about, well, you incapacitate, you take people out of society in the hope that it prevents crime. Well, you know, as John has given some examples there, it really doesn't prevent things like pollution, things like the COVID situation. It doesn't prevent harm. And crime is commissioned in prisons, it takes place in prison, and it can be organised inside and outside. So even by all of that logic, our use of prison doesn't make sense. What prison does really well is inflict harm. So there are about, 79,000 people in prison in England and Wales, about 3,000 of those are women. We've got a really, really high self-inflicted death rate. About one prisoner in every 4 days will take their own life in prison. Really, really high levels of self-inflicted death, really, really high levels of self-harming in prison, particularly in the female estate. So all prison succeeds in doing is inflicting harm. And those harms can then filter out into the wider communities as well. So I think we need to really, really think carefully about why prison. You know, that is a really simplistic answer to what are quite complex social, political, economic, cultural problems that we seek to answer through prison, when actually what prison succeeds in doing is inflicting further harm. But just on that question of public and private prisons, you know, there's some research that suggests that the private prisons have 47% higher levels of violence. And that's really, really significant if your baseline is a really high level of violence anyway. Okay, but there's also that moral question for me, which is a massive one. Is it right? Is it morally justifiable that groups like G4S, Serco, Sodexo are literally making millions from punishment, from the infliction of harm? You know, and for me, I'm really, really uncomfortable about that. And that these companies, in and of themselves, they don't have the best record when it comes to committing things like fraud. You know, they were involved in tagging dead people and charging us for it. Tagging people that weren't really being tagged and charging us for it. So when we think about crime, when we think about harm, when we think about the offender, I think we need to think really, really carefully about the state and state corporate harms in all of this.
Could you just describe how the prison what the prison industrial complex is, and maybe what you've just mentioned about how private companies are profiting from it? So that's basically, you know, that's our capitalist system, isn't it? Or a system where we have shareholders that need to see returns from their shares, and so then you have those companies running these services. To me, that doesn't add up. You know, yeah, maybe if you could just describe what it is.
I mean, the role of private companies in terms of making profit from cheap prison labour, it's almost reminiscent of the original penitentiary system during the 18th century, when prisons were built to discipline and punish the rebellious poor. There were three fundamental institutions in very deprived urban areas during the Victorian times. One was a factory, the other one was a workhouse, the third was the prison. They were the life choices of the very poor. The poor were sent to prison at the dawn of capitalism to be trained and disciplined to work. And here we are today, where private companies are using prison labour and forcing prisoners, into providing cheap labour. And it's used by the state as a gauge for rehabilitation. Providing you go to work, don't question the conditions under which you work, don't question the paltry so-called wage that you get. You are suitably rehabilitated to return to society and become a good, honest worker. So the role of the prison, even the modern penitentiary prison, is very reminiscent of why prisons were created. To discipline, control and exploit the undeserving poor.
They're very Victorian or sort of even pre-Victorian ideas, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Of way of structuring society.
But I think the worrying thing is, particularly in terms of Britain and America, I don't think anybody can seriously argue that prisons work. They clearly do not work. So what is driving prison? And it's driven by the prison industrial complex. That is what is driving the expansion of the prison system, particularly in America. It's not about public protection. It's not about law and order. It's about making profits, become a source of cheap labour. That's why prisons now exist. It's an economic entity.
I would absolutely echo what John is saying there. If we look at the number of organisations, the number of corporations and businesses that have a vested interest in this expansion of the carceral state, the punishment state, it's everything from criminal justice agencies, and I'm including criminologists in this as well. We profit from the public imagination around crime and punishment. It's lawyers, it's solicitors, it's prison staff, it's the police, it's private companies, it's construction industries, it's architects. This is a massive network of corporations and corporate interests that seek to benefit from punishment. And I think there's a fabulous quote from a criminologist called Pat Carlin, who argues that if prison worked, it would put itself out of business. So if prisons deterred, if prisons incapacitated, if prisons did anything about crime prevention, they put themselves out of business.
Of course, yeah. And we have evidence that large multinational security corporations in America have been lining the pockets of certain judges to send more and more people to prison as a source of cheap labour.
And if we're talking about the labour in prisons, you're looking at people who are earning £1 a day. And it's also, I don't want to get too tied into this idea of work as a value, as a way of putting value on people's lives, because I don't think that's the way we should organise society so much. But what prisons do is they take job opportunities away from the community outside.
Absolutely.
So often when we talk about prison expansion, there's an argument that, it benefits the local community.
Absolutely.
But actually, it depresses wages in the local community. The people working in terms of staff are generally underpaid within the prison sector, particularly in private prisons. And also it can put strains on healthcare because the money doesn't follow this increase in the population. So a lot of the rhetoric around expanding the prison estate starts to fall apart when you look at the facts.
Absolutely. But as you say, sorry,
John.
No, go on.
That expansion, that idea of expansion is led by this idea of growth, isn't it? Which again that's a great quote you had, Lisa. That's a complete misnomer with the idea of what it's trying to solve. You know, increasing prison populations. Like, is that our objective? What why do we want more people in prisons? Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'd
But
like,
sorry, I was just saying, an increasingly right-wing authoritarian political climate, prisons are going to be used increasingly, you know, as instruments of social control and repression, and you know, that relationship, you know, between political climate and atmosphere and rising prison populations, particularly in America, is so obvious. You know, they are instruments of social control and terror against marginalised, vulnerable, working class groups, and particularly black people. You know.
Yeah, I wanted to gain some more knowledge from all of you about alternatives, or this idea of like just punishment, or is there any ethics in punishment, and whether punishment is the right way to go about things. And you know, it varies so drastically dependent from case to case. But yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on sort of like alternative structures that you know of or anticipate.
One of the first things that comes to mind here is something which has been known as Scandinavian penal exceptionalism. Big fancy word for a different approach to punishment, or at least in theory, a different approach. So if we look at some of the Nordic countries, for example, if we look at Halden prison in Norway, the people in there the cells resemble student accommodation, to be brutally honest. And the people in there will have access to things like music studios, to a really well-stocked supermarket. They're encouraged to form really positive relationships between staff and the people in the prison. So the prison looks very, very different to what we have here. You know, I used to work with the Independent Monitoring Board, so I got to see the insides of prisons, and the Norwegian example is very, very different. And that's often put forward as a humane prison, but actually there are still massive problems. So the self-inflicted death rate in Halden is 8 times higher than what it is in the population outside. The prisons have been pulled up for their use of strip searching, for their use of isolation units, especially for young people. So all of these ideas of what a humane prison might do, again, they don't hold water. So, you know, I think we really, really need to think about that language of humane punishment. Punishment is the choice to inflict suffering. And I find it really, really hard to see that as anything other than inhumane, to be honest.
I don't know whether this is a good parallel or not, but I mean, since becoming a parent and thinking about parenting and reading and learning how to do it, struggling to do it, like, you realise how much parenting has changed, and that we don't, I suppose this, where I'm going with this is it relates to institutions and the way we organise society as well. You know, we don't put children in the cupboards under the stairs anymore. We don't beat them, you know, so that the idea of punishment in parenting has shifted. And I suppose I just made that kind of connection where I thought, oh, actually in society, in a more wide way, we haven't come up with other ways of being, maybe the other approaches that you would take in parenting, being compassionate, connected, dealing with the root cause of something, you know. And I don't know, just wondered if, there's several ideas in prison, aren't there, about like punishment, separation, and rehabilitation. But I've heard from you, you know, that all of those ideas are problematic, actually.
Well, I think the whole concept humane prison is a bit of an oxymoron, isn't it, to be honest? Prisons intrinsically and structurally are intended to disempower completely the captive. Rehabilitation doesn't happen in prison. There are two approaches to the prison problem, two strategies. One is prison reform, One is prison abolition. Prison reform has achieved absolutely nothing over the last 100 years. All it's basically done is actually strengthened and legitimised prisons by persuading the public that actually, despite the horror of prisons and the brutality, they still nevertheless have the potential to rehabilitate. They don't. It's a false argument. Nobody's being rehabilitated by being completely disempowered and dehumanised and held in cells. Prisons don't work. The alternative is prison abolition, but I don't think you can look at prison abolition in isolation from a wider struggle or movement to change the social and economic and structures that create this prison population. And that's what I find really inspiring about the Black Lives Matter movement. They're able to draw these connections between racism, institutionalized racism of the police, and prisons. So we can't seriously discuss abolishing prison within the context of a society that creates inequality, disempowerment and poverty, racism, etc. The struggle for prison abolition has to be tied in to a wider social and political struggle to transform society and empower the community. Because what prisons effectively do, apart from disempowering prisoners, they also disempower the community. The whole criminal justice system is designed to do that. Total state power. The rest of us are passive onlookers. What we need to do is create a whole different concept of justice, restorative justice, transformative justice, empower the community to take care and deal with these problems. But that will not be achieved until we carry out or are able to achieve a fundamental, revolutionary change of the way this society and system is structured and organised. Abolitionism cannot be seen in isolation from the wider political struggle for.
Yeah, and again, I absolutely second what John is saying there. I think often there is at least an initial public perception that abolitionism is closing the prisons tomorrow. And there's a real discomfort around that. But actually, abolitionism is a process. It's about all of those social changes in terms of the economy, in terms of our social structures, in terms of culture. You know, I've been thinking a lot about masculinity and why we see so many men in prison. So masculinity needs to change. So sexism, racism, homophobia, all of that needs to shift. Economic inequality needs to shift. The treatment of people with disabilities needs to shift. The way in which we talk about sexuality needs to shift. So that this isn't something that happens overnight. This is something that will be a gradual process. And it's something that has its roots in a lot of radical black feminism in the States and this country, but also in some of the Scandinavian work by Thomas Mathieson, Niels Christie and Luke Husman, who argue about not getting rid of the prison and leaving nothing, but replacing it with this transformation of society, the transformation of what gets criminalised as well.
Absolutely.
You know, so much of the harm we experience actually falls outside of the criminal justice system. And yet we criminalise things like drug use that we don't have to. You know, Portugal has not legalised, but decriminalised all drug use. So they've taken it away from criminal justice and put it into a medical healthcare model. I'm not saying that's a panacea, but I'm saying it's definitely worth thinking about. So there is so much here to unpack, and it's a failure of the imagination. Prison looks like common sense because we've been led to believe that it's been a historical constant. You know, when it hasn't been for a start, we're led to believe that this is the thing to do in response to crime, but actually the social world is much, much more complex than that.
I wanted to jump in and maybe ask a little bit of a pessimistic question of like, do you think in the reality that these absolute social reforms could ever be actually achievable, considering, as John mentions, as prison as being like a microcosm of wider society? Do you think that we would eventually get to a point within the next few generations where we could achieve something like this, which can then trickle down into changing all of the other structures that we operate with. And that's something that I'm really unsure of and sort of can be quite skeptical of, but I don't know if you guys have any thoughts, more educated thoughts in regards.
I think essentially we have to hope that things will radically change and never lose faith or hope in that. Things are undoubtedly going to change very fundamentally and very radically because of the way society is moving at the moment, and it has been for the past 20 years, the economic crisis, austerity, etc. So we're going to go through a period of very intense struggle, almost a dark age. Society has a straight choice. We're at a crossroads. We either take the progressive route, okay, collectivise society, humanise society, attack the sources of inequality and poverty, and carry out a fundamental change in that area, or we submit to pessimism, and we're heading down a very, very dark, frightening road. So we have to believe in struggle, and we have to commit ourselves totally to that struggle. Because if we don't, a time will be passed when just to protest or stand up and be counted could risk being murdered. And as America shows, we're approaching that position now. So, you know, we have to believe and hope that change, fundamental change, is possible. The current system doesn't work, as epitomised by the prison system, which, as you said, is a microcosm of the wider society. It does not work, and it's reaching a situation of extreme crisis. It's in meltdown, the prison system at the moment, absolute meltdown, particularly with the permanent 24-hour lockdown. They've become warehouses, pure warehouses of human suffering. It can't continue. So there are two ways it can go. We can fundamentally change it progressively for the better, or we can let it deteriorate even more. And that is very frightening, and that's a very dark idea and, you know, image. But reaching the crossroads, sooner or later, we're going to have to make a choice which way we go.
John, this is a little tangent, but you mentioned about the COVID crisis, and I know we spoke a little bit before we started this broadcast about how you've experienced COVID, but how was that experience within the prison institution, and what has that experience been like in the aftermath, in the release from there?
Well, they just began the lockdown just before I was released on parole. The reality is that the Prison Officers Association has been campaigning for at least the last 10 years for a lockdown of prisons, because they said they're completely out of control, the level of violence against staff and other inmates, drug use, etc., etc., and lack of staff. They have been campaigning for this lockdown for at least 10 years. And I'm in contact with some people in the maximum security prison system, and they have already been told that regardless of the public health issue and whether coronavirus decreases or not, the lockdown in the prison system is going to remain indefinitely. Prisons are in a state of permanent lockdown, like American supermax prisons, and it's something the state actually wanted for a long, long time, and have now been provided with a public health reason to do it. Prisons will remain largely locked down.
I mean, I think that speaks a lot to the difficulty of having hope.
Oh, I think Lisa's just cut out her internet for a second, but that's fine. Maybe we can talk about something else whilst we wait for her to log back in.
It makes me think what you were saying, John, about I know we wanted to talk tonight about the idea of the prisons being out of the public.
The nature of punishment.
Oh, sorry, Lisa, you cut out for like a really long time then.
Do you want to start that point again, because we missed?
Sorry? She's cut out again.
Oh no, Lisa, I think you got a poor connection. You can try to log back out and then join again.
Oh, there she is.
Oh, here we go.
Am I all right now? I'm back online?
Yeah.
Sort of.
No. Okay.
Sorry, yeah, maybe we should carry on with John.
Well, no, sorry, Ruth?
Oh, just about how so much, well, prisons are literally out of the public eye, and you know, the way that you know, me being able to do a project in a prison is a kind of unusual privilege thing, and I had this very unusual access that I would not have normally had. And I think that what a strange thing that is, that prison is part of society, and yet most people don't have an idea really of what it's like. And that, you know, the media, any media depiction of prison is highly mediated, because well, I assume, you know, because that the Ministry of Justice want to present a certain image of what's going on, you know. But we should go back to Lisa to finish your point. Sorry.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so penal shifts. So, you know, we've shifted from our use of transportation, we've shifted from our use of the death penalty. So our use of prison isn't a given. You know, it can shift and it can change. And that might take another 200 years or so. But I'm hopeful that there can be change. There certainly seems to be more of a dialogue, more of a public interest, more of a media interest in prison and in criminal justice in the last few months, from what I've seen. But yeah, trying to stay hopeful, and trying to also part of this abolitionist movement is about reflecting on our own practice as well. You know, are there ways in which I perpetuate the idea of punishment in my life? You know, so that this can be a really challenging reflection. You know, are there ways in which I cause harm? Are there ways in which I experience harm? And can I start to undo some of that punishment impulse that we might have? So yeah, you know, abolitionism, it really starts at the personal level as well as these wider structures for me.
It's interesting thinking about that in relation to Black Lives Matter, isn't it? And you know, Amy Cooper calling, I mean, that this all happened at around the same time, didn't Amy Cooper calling the police on a black man in Central Park because she has the power as a white woman to get him arrested, you know. And yeah, so she knows those systems and she can manipulate those systems as a white woman. And yeah, where am I going with this? That we have to undo those thinkings and those privileges in our own mind.
You know, scapegoating despised minorities has always been a useful form of social control, hasn't it? And that's why the media play into it, so, you know, so energetically. So, and it justifies the existence of prison, because within our societies, apparently, there's these demonized groups, and all public hatred and rage is focused on them, you know? And that's very, very difficult to shift or change, unfortunately. And when you have a social situation, particularly at the moment, where people are feeling very insecure, very depressed, and the media is whipping up this scapegoatism, people's rage and anger and fear becomes focused on those small, despised minority of people, most of whom are in prison. And it's used to justify the existence of prison, to punish, you know, this hated group of people. And it's a cultural phenomena, you know, and it's used overall for social control. You know, the ills of society are the fault of this small, despised minority. That's why prisons exist, to conceal them and take them away from the rest of society. That's the ideological justification for prison. And unfortunately, a large percentage of the population subscribe to that. And it's trying to shift that mindset that it's extremely difficult, extremely difficult.
John, I wanted to ask you about systemic racism more specifically, because I've personally felt like there's been shifts in which minority groups have been targeted by racisms dependent on influxes of migrations from particular areas of the world. And I want to know if you ever felt that that was mimicked inside of the prison system, like were there particular points in time where there was a particular group of people that were more marginalized and or more threatened than others?
Yeah, I mean, racism has always been an intrinsic part of the prison system. I first came to prison in the 1970s, and the treatment of black prisoners in particular was absolutely disgusting, openly racially abused by staff. Irish prisoners, particularly those accused of crimes they hadn't committed, such as the Birmingham Six, almost murdered by staff and inmates. If you look at some of the worst prisons in this country, the amount of young black prisoners there are disproportionately represented, whereas if you go to sort of more liberal type prisons, there's fewer black prisoners. So racism is systemic within the prison system, it really is. For example, if you look at the separation wings at the moment, which are used to separate unmanageable prisoners, or the close supervision centres, they're disproportionately populated by black prisoners and Muslim prisoners, okay? Very, very few white racist prisoners in those units. Mostly young black prisoners or Asian prisoners, Muslim prisoners or politicised prisoners. So racism, as prisoners, a microcosm of the wider society, racism is endemic within the prison system, endemic within the prison system. And it needs to be challenged, and fortunately there has been some organisation among black prisoners to try and resist and challenge that. But there's a long way to go, a long way to go.
Lisa, do you have any thoughts on overrepresentation of
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we are a racist, white supremacist society. So all of our criminal justice institutions reflect that. You know, that they are, as John has said, of society, they're not apart from it. So statistically, if we look, 26% of our prisoners are so-called BAME. If we look outside, it's probably about 13-14%. So we've got an overrepresentation in prison. And I don't want to conflate Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, because there are differences both within and between all of those groups. But there is a really significant racism within the criminal justice system. You know, if we look at things like stop and search, if we look at deaths in custody, police custody, where restraint has been a feature, we see the overrepresentation of black people. If we look at deaths in custody where the use of force has been part of it, again, we see the overrepresentation of black people. So it's a real issue. And I just want to read out a couple of stats that I've got here. Black people are 53% more likely than white people to be given a prison sentence for an indictable offence at the Crown Court. Asian people are 55%, and other ethnic groups, 81% more likely to be sent to prison. And if we look at the odds of receiving a prison sentence for drug offences, it's 240% higher for Black, Asian, minority ethnic people. So there's a racial disparity right the way through the criminal justice sector. But at the moment, it's particularly an issue in the youth custody sector. So our youth custody is actually falling historically, but the proportion of Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups is increasing. So our youth custody sector is about half BAME at the moment. And a lot of this is about the perception of gangs. So that there has been a use of a gangs matrix where young black men have found themselves on the gangs matrix simply because they were involved in a music video. There's some incredible research by Patrick Williams on this, and Becky Clark, that found that this matrix was treating violence by young black men very, very differently to violence by young white men. On one hand, it was being called gang violence. On the other, it was being called serious youth violence. And there would be differences in the policing that resulted from those categories. So we've got real issues with gang matrices. We've got real issues with stop and search still, right? That this has been, with the 80s and earlier, that we've had issues about the racial disparity in stop and search, which doesn't do anything to do with crime. We know this. But we've also got issues around joint enterprise. So joint enterprise can apply where you're in a group, somebody commits an offence, you can be convicted of that offence. And again, that's disproportionately impacting the criminalisation of young black men and young Asian men in particular, those groups. So this is not new. And I think it speaks to the history of criminal justice in terms of what John's been talking about, in terms of the control of particular groups. But also, for me, we need to go further back and think about links to colonialism. So links to the colonial state, where some people were dehumanised and seen as lesser. And I think that's really, really important, that we think about the colonial context of things like policing, our use of incarceration. All of it has its roots in the denial of humanity to others.
Lisa, this is really interesting. Before we carry on with colonialism and decolonisation, etc., we had a question pop up whilst you were speaking, just asking if you could expand upon what gang matrix, what they are.
Okay, so the piece of research which you can access through the Centre for Crime and Criminal Justice Studies by Patrick Williams and Becky Clark of Manchester Metropolitan University found that the police were building networks primarily for young black and Asian men, where they would network your associates. They would network the people that appeared in music videos. So gradually, the police were building up a database of intelligence simply about who you might be hanging around with. And they were calling this a gangs matrix. But when you look at it, what you see is this was primarily targeted at Asian men and black men. It wasn't targeted at serious youth violence by young white men. It wasn't organised in the same way. The networks weren't constructed to the same extent or in the same way. So yeah, I think it's really, really worth checking that out if you can do it. It's all online, it's all publicly available. But I think it says a lot about this image of the gang and the racialisation of that gang image. We don't talk using the same language anymore about gangs in Glasgow and knife crime in Glasgow. That wasn't primarily young black men, young Asian men, that was young white men. So that, there's a real power in that term gang, that the racialisation of that term gang then filters in and through our criminal justice response to it.
And there's something kind of interesting in the idea of racialising or grouping people from being involved in a music video. I think there's a strange intersection between culture and assumption, culture and sort of stereotyping, and I think the whole youth gang thing definitely is very prominent in the groups that you were talking about. I don't really have a question out of this. I just found that to be quite interesting, and I guess I'm kind of curious if there's any other elements of cultural identity that you feel are more focused upon at all?
You mean? Yeah. I think if we look at some of the Islamophobia in the criminal justice system and things like the prevent strategy, which asks statutory bodies to look out for signs of radicalisation in the people that they might interact with. So, you know, there's a lot of Muslim boys and girls, men and women that have found themselves found that their allegiance questioned. You know, this idea that you must speak out about terror attacks, or you somehow support them. We don't talk in that way about whiteness. It seems to be that we talk about it only when things happen that are carried out by Muslims. So, you know, I think there's lots to think about in terms of the prevent strategy. I think there's lots to think about in terms of how we use this label terrorism against particular groups and not other groups when they carry out forms of political violence. You know, I'm thinking about some of the far right attacks that we've seen recently. Yeah.
We've touched upon the topics of drugs particularly, and I think it was actually you, Lisa, that was talking about decriminalisation, and decrim is something that I'm quite interested by in many different sort of aspects of crime and punishment. I wanted to hear your thoughts a little bit more about decriminalisation versus legalisation. Yeah.
So in terms of drugs, I think it's really, really interesting to think about.
In a broader sense as well, sorry, not just specific to drugs. I think drugs is a major component, but also I'm thinking of things like sex work, for example, and going on from there. There's a lot of different things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we need to think really, really carefully about harm. You know, how important is harm when we think about what things should or shouldn't be criminalised? So yeah, I would be broadly in favour of a decriminalisation approach to things like sex work, to things like the what is now the illegal drugs industry. Because once you do that, once you shift those things into a health model, it changes our use of punishment completely. You know, it changes an awful lot of our crime, which in some cases can be to acquire money to use for drugs. So I think, yeah, I think it's really, really important to have those conversations about what is criminalised and what isn't.
There's also an aspect of how the social contract itself in that moment of transaction is severely changed. If you are a person who is seeking something, be it drugs or whatever else, and you know that you are labelled as a criminal at this point onwards, your behaviour might be drastically different from it being seen as a crime rather than a question of health.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly arguments in criminology about deviance and about a self-fulfilling prophecy. So when you are labelled as the deviant, you are labelled as the other, then that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and then that leads to greater isolation. It leads to the breakdown of some social bonds. So yeah, I think that's definitely something which is worth thinking about further. You know, and a lot of these models around the sex industry, for example, what they succeed in doing is actually pushing the sex industry further underground. So it stops sex workers who may have had experiences of violence and abuse then going to the police because they fear the consequences. And also, I think what we need to think about is also migration. So migrants in the sex industry might be particularly vulnerabilised by such an approach. If we think about how that approach then relates to the hostile environment and border controls, and it makes them less likely to come forward and talk about their experiences, be it within the sex trade, be it within trafficking, whatever, because they might fear deportation and detention. So all of these forms of state violence, all of these things of state corporate violence, because, you know, G4S and Serco are well integrated in the immigration control estate. You You know, we need to really, really think carefully about the values underpinning these systems and the harm that they cause.
That's really interesting to hear about those moments when those areas where the incarceration, where prison system and the immigration system cross over, because they are different systems with different issues, aren't there? But some are shared. Or do you see them as very much connected?
Yeah, I would see them as very, very, very connected, even in terms of the penal architecture, the punishment architecture. So if we look locally, if we look at Moreton Hall has been young offenders, it's been a women's prison, then it was immigration detention and removal until the last few months, when it's looking likely that it'll be returned to the HMP estate, the prison estate. So yeah, I think all of these things are about control, all of these things are about othering, and all of these things are about populations which are perceived to be dangerous. So you remove them from society, you hide them away. You know, I think the way in which we talk about immigration is striking at the moment, because the violence of it is so overt. You know, the channel crossings, the way we've spoken about the military being used, the way in which we talked about hostile environment, the way in which children are now being targeted. You know, for me at the moment, it's becoming, it's always been there. It's been more and less subtle, but particularly at the moment, I think we're seeing a real rise of right-wing, nationalist, far-right rhetoric, actually in the centre of government.
We had a question pop in. I know we're going to do Q&As at the end, but we had a question pop in that I think might be interesting for both of you to sort of engage with. And it reads, are there health impacts to the chronic fear of state violence or the constant surveillance certain groups experience or being seen as a threat? So are there health impacts to the chronic fear?
Yeah, I think it's really, really hard to sort of evidence a monocausal aspect to this, that this feeling led to this. But I think if we look at prisoners' own testimonies, an awful lot of prisoners' own testimonies and own memoirs will talk about that feeling of unsafety, that impact of being an outsider, that impact of othering. I did some research with ex-prisoners in Northern Ireland not too long ago, and some of them spoke about how that actually psychologically that was the most damaging thing for them, to be thought of as outsider, to be thought of as dangerous, to be thought of as being deserving of the harm that was inflicted on them through state violence. So yeah, you know, I think it's entirely reasonable to assume that these things will do psychological harm to people.
John, did you have any experience of this in your time inside at all?
Yes, I did, certainly. The proportion or the amount of mentally ill prisoners now in the prison system has risen incredibly, and their treatment whilst in prison has just... Can you hang on a minute? I'll just turn this phone off. Thank you.
No problem, mate.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, you know, the psychological impact of imprisonment can be quite considerable. And I think probably the overwhelming majority of prisoners suffer with some mental disorder or mental health issue. And they're placed into an environment which accentuates that. But you're right, it actually starts in the community, particularly communities that are targeted by the police, ethnic minority communities, for example. You know, these communities are targeted and they create an atmosphere of fear in those communities and paranoia. And it does psychologically affect the people that are being targeted, particularly if they're made to feel completely alienated and marginalised from normal people. They sometimes internalise that, unfortunately, and they develop quite serious mental illnesses. and then being received into the prison system, which is an incredibly, particularly some prisons, incredibly brutal places. And at the moment, you know, the 24-hour lockdown almost, people with mental health issues are deteriorating quite rapidly. And you're absolutely right. You know, prison is now being used to disappear these groups into the system because of the cutbacks, particularly in mental health treatments, etc., and the closure of institutions. These people are now finding their way into the prison system. So you have people within the prison system who suffer with extreme mental illness such as schizophrenia. And the way the prison system deals with it is not in a therapeutic medical way, it deals with it in a punitive disciplinary way. So a disproportionate amount of mentally ill prisoners find themselves in segregation or solitary confinement or close supervision centres and are subject to brutality or, control and restraint. So it really is in some jails an horrific situation. They have, I mean, you know, prisons today now sound, feel, when you're within them, a modern bedlam, heavily populated by prisoners with severe mental health issues, and their condition is becoming increasingly worse. Prison is now being used as a solution to the mental health problem, particularly among poor black communities, and they're being incarcerated. And it's an abuse of human rights, and it's a crime against humanity, actually. But of course, these are the scapegoats, you know, these are the despised groups that the rest of society is encouraged to despise and hate.
I think one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet too much is the gender angle when we talk about our use of prison. So again, I don't want to, you know, get too much into statistics, but if we look at the women's estate, so there's about 12 women's prisons. There are none in Wales. So you commit an offence in Wales as a woman, there's not a single women's prison in the entirety of Wales. We look at the reasons women are in there, we're looking at about 80% for non-violent offences. When we look at the male estate, it's about 67%. Female estate is about 80%. Half of women experience abuse as children. About 1 in 3 were in care. Half have drug addiction issues on entry to prison. About 60% have significant issues with alcohol. 2 out of 3 experience domestic violence and abuse prior to prison. 2 out of 3 report depression. 1 in 3 prior to prison have made a serious suicide attempt. And about 1 in 3 women in prison have already been in psychiatric care prior to entry into prison. And then on release, about 40% of women in prison won't have a stable home to go to. So there are real problems of who ends up being criminalised and who ends up in prison in the first place. But I think there are also problems about to what extent are prison conditions further causing psychological harm to people. And something which has really lived with me since I heard about it is the use of strip search in prisons, in men's prisons, but particularly in the women's prisons. You're dealing with a population who have been vulnerabilised. A lot of your female prisoners would have experienced abuse, sexual abuse in the past. And there's some incredible testimony from women in prison who've experienced strip searching as a form of sexual abuse. But we don't talk about these things. We don't talk about these things. We take them absolutely for granted. We see them as necessary. This is despite the fact that some of the, you know, the state's own research has said that there's an overuse of strip searching in the women's estate, and that it doesn't tend to find anything. And then again, when we look at both male and female prisoners, but particularly for female prisoners, I think it's worth thinking about the impact on the people outside. So 9 out of 10 children who have a mother in prison are removed from the home. So they end up in the looked after, the care estate. And we know from what John has said and from what statistics have said that there's a pathway from care into the prison system. So all this prison that's designed allegedly to respond to harm is actually creating and causing intergenerational harm in families, right? Or orbiter issues, harm in families, harm in communities, harm in wider society. The only thing prison succeeds in doing is the infliction of harm. It fails by its own logic, if anything else.
It's not. So you talked about women, and I just wanted to ask as well about non-binary people and also their LGBTQ plus experience, like that must have its own, present particular problems and opportunities for trauma.
I mean, this is a particular hot button, I hate that phrase, a hot button issue at the moment in terms of the treatment of trans prisoners and gender recognition certificates. So if we look at the experience of trans women in particular, we see experiences of victimization and violence, sexual abuse, bullying, harassment in the male estate. So trans women being held in the male estate. And that there's a discussion about whether trans women should be put in the female estate, and often that discussion hinges on ideas around risk, that there is something inherently dangerous about a trans woman being housed in the women's estate. And an awful lot of debate about this in terms of levels of safety. But actually, if you look at the research, it suggests that trans women are more likely to be victimised than actually to be the perpetrators of sexual violence. So, I think this is an issue that really needs to look at the evidence rather than all the heat around it. In terms of other aspects of LGBT and non-binary prisoners, I know there's been talk about a non-binary unit in Scotland. I'm not sure if that went ahead or not. I've got a feeling that it did. But also for all prisoners, but particularly for that group of prisoners, speaking about people like they're homogenous, there are issues around mental health, there are issues around access to healthcare, there are questions around whether people feel safe. They report higher levels of a lack of safety often, people from LGBT backgrounds. And also that question of whether or not being out, is it safe to be out? What are the consequences of being out? And what is the psychological harms of not being out? So yeah, it's a really, really important discussion, which, to be honest, I don't think the government or the Ministry of Justice is really thinking about enough, particularly in terms of lesbian, gay and bisexual prisoners.
Before we sort of hand over to the audience, there's just a few more questions I wanted to ask. One of them was something that we actually touched upon earlier in the talk as well, of I think me and Ruth were talking a lot about our place in these discussions and where we fit in, and we were very conscious, and maybe this is something you would like to actually educate us on, John, is do you feel that by doing projects in prisons or about prisons or speaking about them in the way that we're doing right now, do you think it's actually supporting the current structure of things?
It depends. It depends. I think you've got to stay focused on what should be the prime objective, which is prison abolition. Now, I'm not a reformist. However, I think there are two types of reform. There are those that re-establish and strengthen the system, and there are those that can weaken the system. And I think there is valuable work to be done within prison, but it always has to be borne in mind that the point and the objective of that work is to empower prisoners and collectively empower them. Because short of radical reform or abolition, the only way the prison conditions and the treatment of prisoners can in any way become, I say improved, is by prisoners themselves collectively organising and coming together. And I think any work done within the prison system, by people like yourselves, has got to keep that as a prime objective and motive. That it's not about disguising the reality of the prison system, or trying to find the good parts of the prison system, or encouraging the prison system to be a degree more benevolent and humane towards prisoners, that isn't going to work, because we've already agreed that prisons structurally, intricately and historically are places of repression. Any work within the prison system that is done must be essentially and fundamentally to empower prisoners collectively in order to shift that internal balance of power. Because it's the relationship and balance of power between staff and prisoners in jail that is the source of a lot of the abuse that goes on, and the abuse of human rights. Because many prison officers feel they have an absolute degree, and where a prison is a hidden society, their activities are hidden from the public, and they feel they have an absolute degree of power over prisoners. As I said, you know, the social or civil status of prisoners is not unlike slaves. And that is the source of the abuse, as far as a lot of prison officers are concerned. And I think any work done within prison amongst prisoners must be motivated by that desire and that intention of collectively empowering prisoners and encouraging them to collectively empower and challenge the system. And that can be done in many ways, artistic, literature, whatever. But it's got to create that consciousness amongst prisoners that together they can change the system.
Thank you so much, John. I don't know if you had any thoughts, Lisa, but we also got a few questions trickling in as well. Maybe I'll just ask this first one, because it's actually a really important question. And it's, what can we as Joe Public do to help? What can we outside of any of these institutions actually do to help?
Well, I think that's a really, really important question. I was hoping somebody would ask that. I think first and foremost is to find out more. You know, to find out more about the way in which we use prison, who is incarcerated, what are the consequences of incarceration. So, you know, websites like Inquest will be a good place to start. There's a Bent Bars project, which I think would be worth looking at for LGBTQ prisoners. There are groups like CAPE, Communities Against Prison Expansion, which do what they say on the tin, that they're seeking to prevent the expansion of this prison carceral estate. So yeah, I think see what local groups are out there. I think get as educated as we can be about what happens in prison. You know, you could try writing to your MP if you like. But yeah, those would be my main things. And also that abolitionist logic, you know, in our own home lives. You know, can we start to disconnect from this abolitionist logic, this punitive logic, which is about punishment in our own interactions?
John, any thoughts on that? What can we as a public do to help?
I absolutely agree. I mean, in terms of outside support organisations and groups, we can go back as far as the 70s and the organisation PROP, Preservation of the Rights of Prisoners. They're incredibly effective in terms of supporting prisoners and forming a link to the outside community in order to support prisoners. And that is possible. The group that I'm currently involved in, the Prisoners Solidarity Network, we're forming links within the prison system and trying to create that network within the prison system of resistance and organisation. There's a hell of a lot the outside groups can do. And in my own experience, when the state and the prison authorities become aware that there are groups on the outside who actively support prisoners, it worries them incredibly. The whole purpose of prison is to isolate, okay, and disappear. And that is when the abuse happens. When outside groups become involved and begin to highlight what's going on within the prison system and actively support the prisoners in various ways, that weakens the power of the prison system considerably, because it's building those links between the disempowered in prison and groups of activists and collective groups outside. If we can establish those networks of support and solidarity, we can go a long, long way, as I say, to empowering prisoners and leading eventually to the final abolition of prisons. But we've got to build those links with the community. They're so vital.
know, and there are also things that, you know, we can do in terms of the penal industrial complex that we've spoken about earlier. You know, I know of people who've gone to AGMs and raised questions with the leadership of Serco and G4S about the treatment of people seeking asylum, but also the treatment of prisoners. So yeah, there are ways in which we can not hold these vast corporations to account, because I think I'm pessimistic about that, but begin to shed light on the practices, begin to shed light on their behaviours. So yeah, I mean, I think that question of to what extent do we involve ourselves with the punishment estate is a really, really difficult question to answer. But about 4 or 5 months ago, I pulled out of a project because I was uncomfortable with that kind of interaction between the project and the penal estate. But then there's the question of, well, the immediacy. You know, are there things that we can do to alleviate some minor aspects of the prison experience? So for a while, I volunteered with the Independent Monitoring Board, so trying to ensure that the baseline human rights in prison are protected. I've got questions over the independence of those monitoring boards. I've got questions over the extent to which those boards work. But for me, I got to see the reality of prison, you know, and I got to come out and talk to people about it. So I think that was certainly a useful experience for myself. And I'd like to think that groups like that bring about small, tiny changes in prison. But I'd be really, really loath to say they do any more than that, to be honest.
Is that the IMB you're talking about?
Yeah.
Well, the IMB is a descendant of the Board of Visitors.
Yeah.
And their role was pure and simple, to cover the backsides of violent prison officers and the abuse of prisoners' rights. And I had some awful experiences. I mean, back in the day, if you were placed on report for something particularly serious, like rioting or whatever, you went before an adjudication of the Board of Visitors. They sentenced people to considerable lengths of time in solitary confinement. I was present during a demonstration in Long Larton when we were attacked by prison officers and beaten up. A member of the Board of Visitors stood there smiling. They are there to maintain and enforce the legitimacy of the prison system by saying, hang on, there's an independent body here that's overseeing the behaviour of prison staff. No, they're not. They're part and parcel of the prison system. They're as bad as prison officers, if not worse. They're the devil you know.
Yeah, I think I would really, really question, like you said, that level of independence in that board is really, really problematic.
Who appoints members of the IMB? Who appoints members of the IMB?
True. Yeah.
Guys, we're just to the. Oh, sorry, you're going to say something. Oh, I was just saying we're coming to nearly to the end of the talk, and there was a few questions that were still hanging from earlier. I think it would just be good if we can cover these as well. There's one that I saw that is actually kind of in line with what we would just finished discussing, from Stephanie. I heard recently that the police are now trained in very truncated, austere way. Is the same true for prison wardens, for men and women? And I think we sort of know the answer to that.
In short, yeah. yeah, really, really limited training. You know, we could be looking at something like 12 weeks of training. We've got real issues in terms of the levels of inexperience, and particularly in private prisons. At the moment, an awful lot of our prison staff, our guards, our screws, have got less than 2 years experience. And there's a really quick turnover of staff as well. There's a really quick turnover of staff that are leaving because of mental health problems and issues. And we know that there are problems with alcoholism. We know that there are problems with levels of traumatic stress that prison guards leave the prison with. So this harmful system is harmful to everybody inside of it. It's harmful.
There's actually a follow-up question as well from Steffi still. Are prison officers drawn from particular sectors of society, political, or what is it that draws them into this violent loop?
Can I answer that?
Sure, yeah, go for it.
There's actually been, in my experience, a radical change in the type of prison officers over, say, the last 30 years. When I first came to prison, the majority of prison officers were ex-servicemen, ex-army. And that was a very strong culture in the prison system. The Prison Officers Association was an incredibly powerful organisation and literally ran prisons. And in Wormwood Scrubs, where they were systematically murdering prisoners in a segregation unit, there was a public inquiry after that. Other groups of staff like prison governors, nurses, psychologists, social workers had no say whatsoever. The Prison Officers Association ran the prison system. If you were unfortunate enough to go to a prison like Wandsworth, which was called a hate factory, it was a terrifying experience. It was on like a glass house, actually. And in my experience, it seemed that the type of person back then anyway that was drawn to the profession of the prison officer were basically sadists and psychopaths who could go behind closed walls and give vent to their psychopathy. I remember an occasion I was coming into Wandsworth prison on the van from the court, and I was watching these groups of prison officers sort of scurrying through the gate very, very quietly and heads down. And as soon as they entered the prison, a metamorphosis took place. They became like little dictators swaggering around. So the prison system tended to attract that type of individual, largely from the armed forces. That has now changed, I think, over, say, the past 10 to 15 years. Basically, the authority of the Prison Officers Association, the power of the POA has been broken. So in terms of wages and all the rest of it, that's not as it was. And I think that people largely coming into the system now are basically people looking for work. And they're confronted by a situation within the prisons that a lot of them are absolutely terrified by, which is why after a week, many resign and walk out. So the essential nature of the prison officers has fundamentally changed, I would say, over the past, say, 40 years from what they were. And sort of ironically, there's a better type of individual today. There are bad elements among them. But as far as I know, and as I say, I've just come out of prison, brutality against prisoners in places like Leeds Segregation Unit, Wakefield Segregation Unit, Wandsworth Segregation Unit, Wormwood Scrubs, where prisoners were being deliberately murdered. That has changed to a degree because there's a different type and element of staff now policing and administering these institutions. But that doesn't diminish the dehumanising conditions under which prisoners are still nevertheless held.
It reminds me, about 5 or so years ago, I was actually working with the guy who was formerly a prison officer, and to quote him, the reason why he left was because it turned me into a bastard, is what he said. And he spoke quite in depth to me about like how he started to devalue human life.
Absolutely. Well, if I could, I mean, this is the thing, and you know, you can hark back to the concentration camps and the behaviour of guards in concentration camps. How is a prison guard able to appease their conscience in terms of their treatment of prisoners? And what they tend to do is dehumanise the prisoner, okay? So that they're reassured that they're not really dealing with a real human being. We're dealing with a subhuman element. But what that tends to do is dehumanise the prison officer. Because once you dehumanise another human being, you dehumanise yourself. And that's why prison officers had the highest rate of divorce, because they couldn't turn it off when they went home. They turned it on their wives. Highest rate of alcoholism and a highest death rate 2 years after retirement. So they were more damaged and dehumanised by prisons than the prisoners were.
Just to add to that, there's a really interesting piece of research by Dr. David Scott, who's now at the Open University, where he spoke to prison staff and spoke to them about their experiences of working, their motivations for work. And yeah, it backs up all of these things about the impact of dehumanisation on staff as well, and how that then, as John was saying, leaks into life outside.
They're far more dehumanising prisoners. You know, it's a mutually brutalising and dehumanising environment. But at least prisoners, to a degree, because of their suffering and resistance, tend to find their humanity in collective organisation. By recognising the humanity of fellow prisoners, they recognise their own humanity. Whereas with prison officers, we have this very macho authoritarian culture where prisoners are sort of dehumanised as subhumans. The psychological damage on them is far greater than it is on prisoners.
I asked the last question. Or do you want to...
Oh, sorry, Ruth, didn't hear you there.
Shall I ask this last question?
Yeah, sure. I think there's two. One thing I really quickly wanted to say as well was there was a person who commented saying educate ourselves and remember that we are all part of a collective humanity, which I think is something really, really important. And if people didn't see that comment from the audience, I think that's something to remember. There are two questions. Maybe which one did you want to ask, Colette's or Kerry's?
Oh, I can't see Colette's. Maybe you should ask them.
Sure, I'll ask Colette. She's kindly written an essay for me to read, so I'll try to go through this. Thank you all, Lisa. Thank you all. Lisa's thoughts on, for example, Morton Hall, if I recall correctly, were example Morton Hall were very interesting, as were John's on the importance of external support groups and activists who work to empower and support migrants and prisoners that really make you think about a lack of public understanding or awareness of even the existence of these buildings or of the lives within, especially within our own locality. Where do you think this reluctance to engage or emphasize comes from?
Oh, I think it's a really, really big question. It's really difficult and an important question. I think that there's a lack of public knowledge, absolutely, and I think sometimes we choose collectively to ignore these things, because sometimes it causes us to look at ourselves as well. You know, what role are we playing in perpetuating this form of violence, this form of state structure? What role are we perpetuating? What role are we playing? I think there can be a feeling of helplessness. You know, what do we do? You know, and these things, as I said earlier, they look like they're permanent, but actually they can change. But it's really, really hard to see that in the moment. So this idea of the public being quite punitive, actually when you talk to people, particularly in terms of the women's imprisonment, attitudes seem to shift. Just anecdotally, I gave a talk a couple of years ago about women's experience of prison, and a woman came up to me at the start and she said lots of things, but she said that she didn't feel that prisoners should have the right to vote. You know, that was the level of punitiveness that person was working with. And actually, we had a chat and I did my talk and answered questions, and then at the end she said, actually, I think we should abolish prisons for women. Think seriously about the male estate. And you know, that was just from giving out statistics and talking about who is imprisoned, why they're there, what are the consequences. So I think that the more we can shed light on these institutions, like these closed institutions, the better. And actually not to forget that the prisoners are us, like literally, but the prisoners are us. 99% of people in prison will come out again. So I think we really, really need to think carefully about even how we talk about the prisoner, the ex-prisoner, the offender. I would guarantee every single person watching this is an offender. They've broken the law in some way. They've just never been caught, perhaps. So that psychological and that linguistic separation, that has real consequences. I'm going to stop now before I go on a rant.
Maybe Ruth, you want to just ask the final question, then I could close off the discussion.
Okay, so from Kerry Campbell from Munch of the Future, thank you so much for your education, optimism and courage, John. Your voice is so important. I wondered if you could expand on the possibility of maintaining good communication, relationships and facilitating education amongst yourselves within conditions of the prison and the challenges you face when trying to do that work?
Yeah, I mean, despite my experience of prison being a generally negative and very oppressive experience, there were moments and there were times in some institutions, in some prisons, when the balance of power did shift quite significantly. And we were able to develop facilities like educational facilities, etc. We formed a prisons union, prisoners representative councils, prisoners representative committees, black prisoners representative committees. When we were able to shift that balance of power by the creation of solidarity, we were able to humanize prisoners, empower prisoners. And in a funny sort of way, that was the most rehabilitative process that ever happened before the prison officers during the early 90s seized back control of the long-term prison system and locked it down. It is possible for prisoners, even under the most repressive, austere conditions, to self-organise and empower themselves. I've witnessed it in places like Wakefield, F-Wing segregation unit, where I was held in a subterranean seg unit beneath the ground. One prisoner there, Bob Maudsley, had been held there for over 40 years in a subterranean cage. We were able to organise and empower ourselves to fight back to such a degree where they had to close the unit for at least a month and disperse themselves elsewhere. The people who will ultimately change the prison system are the people within it, but they need the support and the solidarity of groups on the outside, and their struggle in prison needs to be linked to a wider social political struggle. But the seeds of radical change in prison lay with the prisoners themselves. And they are capable of doing that because I've witnessed it over the years. It's a bad time in prison at the moment because of the extreme lockdown, the way that a lot of the guards have been able to foment gang warfare, because make no bones about it, a lot of the gang conflict that goes on in prison is engineered by prison staff for the purpose of divide and rule. And I've directly witnessed that. But I still have great hope because, as I say, I've witnessed it. The prisoners can collectively organise and find a common unity, a common humanity and a common struggle. And when they do, you know, it's like the old saying, you know, we are the many, they are the few. When prisoners do collectively organise, then you see the balance of power radically shift and the whole function of purpose begins to dissolve. But it also needs the support of groups on the outside and the individual on the outside to say, one struggle, one fight. The struggle against the prison system is a struggle against the authoritarian state out here, because it's one body. So we need a common collective struggle.
Guys, thank you so much. Lisa, did you want to add to that at all? Sorry, I didn't see if you were muted.
Such a perfect note to end on, really, the importance of resistance, the importance of collective struggles, of solidarity, and recognising that actually the prison is a small part of this wider transformative justice, which is about how we interact with each other and the structures in which we live our lives. So yeah, resistance, solidarity, getting involved, surveillance, monitoring these estates, and having these kind of conversations, I think is really important too.
Guys, thank you so much. This is definitely, it's been actually really enlightening speaking with you guys today. And I think this is definitely one of those discussions where like an hour and a half will not do it justice. This is something that we need to keep talking about consistently. But alas, thank you very much for your time today. And also thank you to the audience for tuning in and listening in. Before we go, I just wanted to quickly mention the second part of this event, which is going to be taking place this Thursday. So if you've had a look at the website, you would have probably already seen a little bit of a description about it, but it's going to be another discussion, this time around arts education and agency within the prison and also outside of the prison. We're going to be joined by three panelists on Thursday. First of these is Ali Ahmed, who is an individual who spent 2 years in prison serving part of his sentence in Brixton Prison, where he was then employed by National Prison Radio and now produces music for them, or is one of the members of the radio team. There's Andrew Wilkie, who is the Deputy Chief Executive of National Prison Radio. And finally, Fiona Curran, who is the director at Cursor Arts, which is an arts and criminal justice charity. On top of this, I wanted to ask if you could join us on Friday, the 11th of September for It Takes a Decade and The Big Walk, which is an online screening and publication launch, a collaboration with the Justice, Arts and Migration Network seeking to reframe contemporary articulation of the migrant condition, with the focus on the Morton Hall Immigration Removal Centre and the lives within. Again, thank you so much, guys. This talk has been recorded, so you'll see it again online, probably by the end of the week or at least next week. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I really appreciate it. And it's been really insightful and educational. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.